Welcome to the stage, everyone else. We have Corey from Dolomite. We have Brian from AlphaGrowth. Oh, there we go. Gotta get closer to the mic. Why aren't you in the picture, man? And we also have. Oh wait. Say it again. Patrick from More. There we go. Exactly. Yes. So thank you all for joining. Today we're going to talk about DeFi leverage. Now, if you guys have been in the space long enough, you know leverage has been an ever-evolving entity. Maybe some of you got liquidated on like leveraging wrap-staked ETH. Maybe you guys got liquidated on an LRT, and then the entire landscape changed. So we're going to talk about what makes a good leveraging protocol. Are we too leveraged as an industry? Is that giving us any? Well, let me ask them the questions, not you guys. Please introduce yourselves one by one.
So I'm Patrick from More Markets. We're building a lending protocol and a vault infrastructure that allows for treasury management. Do like one-click leverage strategies, one-click migrations between protocols, that kind of stuff.
Cool, Brian Colligan from AlphaGrowth. We are the business development and strategy firm that's helping run compound finance, and so we run DeFi protocols and can talk a lot about compound.
Cool. Corey here from Dolomite, one of the co-founders and creator of it. Been in crypto for quite some time now. I'm actually curious to pass the mic back over to you. What was the relationship that led to AlphaGrowth taking over and working with Compound? I've been around for a while, so I'm just curious to hear more about it.
So we were on the other side. I'll try to do like 30 seconds. So we deployed about 35 million in grants across 9 different chains, and 3 of the chains that we were working with wanted Compound. And so we went to the Compound DAO and was like, hey, we want to buy Compound for a chain. And they're like, no, you have to go through this forum process. And I'm like, I got $10 million in grants. I want to buy it. There was nobody there to sell it. So we got there at the DAO, and there's like, this is not how you do it in DeFi. And I'm like, I need to pay you money, and you need to bring protocol over and tell me how much I need to pay. And they're like, we don't do that. And I'm like, why not? So we got into like big arguments on Discord back and forth, and it was like probably like a 6-7 month process, and then we were able to convince a trial. And in the first 4 months of a trial, we got about it adjusted because it was an ARB and OP token, but it was about $3.6 million of grants on behalf of Compound. And at that point, we were able to basically, the DAO was like, cool, why don't you guys run most of strategy and BD and all operations?
Very cool.
Yeah.
So the first question is, leverage is a scary thing, and I think a lot of people in this space are worried that we are becoming over-leveraged as an industry. So the first question to each of you guys is that an accurate statement? This cycle, is there a systematic risk to chains or DeFi from over-leveraging?
I think the question's like really large, so there's a lot of different ways to kind of go about it. There's different types of leverage. So if you're using like correlated assets to take leverage, it's going to be different than if they're very uncorrelated. I think the health of the markets also play a big role. Like, does the AMM for those tokens have depth? But I do think that it is pretty significantly over leveraged right now. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
Bet more.
Always more.
I think inherently, DeFi protocols are to sell volatility, and our whole entire existence is around hedging and selling leverage. So more leverage is better for the DeFi protocol. As if you're just a bag holder, like on the sidelines, and you just hodl, then you're kind of like, if you're not playing the game, then you're in it. Inherently, yes, I think there is an over-leveraged contagion. There's probably like 2 or 3 over-leveraged contagions. One would be Athena, and then the main one is probably restaking in Eigenlayer.
Just piling on top of that, you basically asked a bunch of picks and shovel sellers if we should be continuing to sell picks and shovels. So the answer is obviously yes. The challenge for us is, how do you do that to the maximal point before it blow up, where we're offering too much to the point where eventually our protocols take on bad debt? And we all have various tools in which that we use to try to mitigate that and deal with adversarial conditions, especially when correlation goes to 1 and bad things happen all at once, it seems. Definitely agree overall with regards to the LRTs and Athena probably being the biggest conduits for leverage in the ecosystem. The way in which those unwind are probably one of the biggest question marks that could lead to mass contagion or not. And certain protocols are, of course, more exposed to that than others. And also some are better equipped than others in order to deal with it.
So one of the things that people have probably experienced in DeFi is a DPEG. We've seen recent DPEGs, we've seen LRT DPEGs, LST DPEGs, YBA, RWAs. I mean, any three-letter acronym you can think of, it's probably DPEG'd at some point in time, and that has hurt people. As a result, we've seen a massive push from market rate oracles to fundamental oracles. And this is a massive consideration for lending protocols. How do you guys address the sort of oracle issue?
So we're just starting right now, and there's a lot of like really young assets on more markets. And so we don't necessarily use market rate oracles for all of the assets. We use indexes to kind of bootstrap these assets, and then we take them over to market rate oracles. And we find that's like a good way to kind of bootstrap these markets and get assets off the ground, but it's not a sustainable way in the long term to price assets on a lending protocol.
The oracle question is really complicated, and I think it's unpriced risk that we still don't have a direct answer to. There's a big discussion on the compound forums going on right now around OEV, Oracle Extractable Value, and kind of to your point earlier, it's like, you know, we're picks and shovels sellers. We get paid on liquidations, right? So I think inherently there's misaligned incentives with the oracle provider. So if you can understand how oracles make money, they basically want to get listed on Compound, and then there's like 3 oracle providers that are blessed to list. Then they have to go pay the oracle provider money, and then once they get paid the oracle provider money, then they can get listed on Compound. So there's a disconnection of like trust assumptions and revenue that's associated with each of the oracle providers. And now with OEV, Oracle Extractable Value, essentially we get paid even more for liquidations. So we're incentivized to create more things that get liquidated, which is kind of like maybe against the social pact that we have with users. And it's I don't know how it's going to play out. It's a big question.
How does that square with the rise of NAV oracles?
I don't know much about that.
Fundamental oracles, so oracles that are backed by the NAV value of a asset.
Yeah, so like vault tokens per se. Yeah. TBD. I mean, we're looking at vault tokens and LP tokens, and how that unwinds is also a question. So who's going to manage the liquidations? It's not completely clear. We're pretty vanilla. I think, you know, you guys are further down the curve on getting where Compound isn't taking as much risk, and we're like watching Fluid and other protocols managing that.
Yeah. So first of all, when it comes to Dolomite, we take a simple approach when it comes to fundamental oracles, which is the asset's backing. Is it redeemable? How is it redeemed? What time period? Is it fully backed? If we can answer all those basic questions with positivity, then generally we try to lean into exchange rate oracles, because we take the posture that a lot of our users on Dolomite and probably other lending protocols as well are taking long-term positions, and they don't want to necessarily unwind it on an illiquid weekend because the banks are closed or some other thing like that is happening. So we're okay with representing to users that we're taking on some degree of risk, that we think things will eventually return to normal. And that is our posturing generally through and through. But we also like to understand, like, when we are using exchange rate feeds, under what conditions can those exchange rates finally get pointed downwards, like in, you know, staked ETH as the example. Everyone likes to think that it's up only, but we like to assume that in the event of a, you know, slashing event, that it should get marked down accordingly, because now its backing is fundamentally changed. So we look at things in that lens. And then speaking as well to a bit of OEV and other categories, you know, Compound's been around a long time. Dolomite has been around since October of 2022, with our previous product being around since 2018. We're trying to take the long vision for everything, so we don't want to liquidate users if we don't have to. We think that our businesses are built over the course of months and years and not weeks or days. And so because of that, you know, we built in some modularity into Dolomite so that we actually could extract OEV on like a DAO level if we wanted, but not necessarily because we want to liquidate people, but just because liquidators in general tend to extract value from the overall product and ecosystem. And if there's a way in which we can at least repurpose that into some mechanism to eventually give revenues back to token holders or things in that regard, at least it can be spun into somewhat of a positive thing, even if it is taken from an unfortunate circumstance.
Love that.
I think there's also a big distinction between like permission market creation and permissionless market creation. Like Morpho is a really interesting example of this, where anyone can kind of spin up a market, set the LTVs, set their own oracles, and the dynamics of that I think are fundamentally different, because you're basically putting your trust in the market creator rather than in the DAO that's controlling those markets or updating the parameters of those markets. And so I think there's potentially much more risk in a permissionless market. And that's up to the user ultimately to determine whether or not they want to enter that.
Well, that brings me to the next question, which is leverage is a function of LTV, and LTVs tend to be determined by perceived risk. These have often been outsourced recently. I think we even had Gauntlet here, maybe Chaos Labs has shown their face. How do each of you guys look at or analyze where an LTV should be set for a certain asset class, or how to determine or analyze liquidation level risks?
This is a pretty contentious topic that we're having at Compound right now across the different service providers. So Gauntlet manages all of that for Compound. We did an analysis on, like, deep analysis on everything that Aave is doing, and we found that there's $15 billion of utilization. On that, there's $8 billion of utilization only in LRTs and LSTs looping. And the only reason Compound in some ways is more we take a tighter spread on the interest rates. And so what should happen is the money should flow from Aave to Compound. But we take on lower collateral factors, right? So people can only get like 8 loops while they can get like 14 loops on Aave, right? So when you're kind of like, it's literally like an argument in the DAO like happening right now. And the way that I would turn this into a story that everybody could imagine is like, imagine that the collateral factor, the loan to value ratio, it was like a racetrack. And if you have a car and a loan to value ratio is like 65 miles an hour, you have a 65% loan to value ratio or collateral factor, and you have another car that's driving 99 miles an hour on the racetrack, the only way, the only way that you can win that race is if the other person on the track crashes, right? So we will never be able to win the race if our collateral factors are lower than Aave's. We have to be at parity with them. And if we're not at parity, then...
Tortoise in the hare.
Right, exactly. So, but like, play that game out, right? And if you talk about like LRTs and LSTs and they unwind and they deleverage and they deloop, like, we're not safe from that. We're going to get caught up in that same contagion as well. So are we really winning?
He who liquidates first liquidates best. There's a lot to unwind there with all of this, because at the end of the day, like, we all set our loan to value ratios independently, but we're all underwriting for very similar assets, and we're all reading from very similar price feeds. It all gets correlated quite a bit. So my joking saying right there does hold some degree of of correctness to it. And we saw this in isolated examples, like with Niche's curve loan. What was it, last year, 2 years ago? And that saying of he who liquidates first liquidates best that did not come from me. That came from a close friend, Wen Moon, from the Arbitrum team. And it boils down to, like, when you're dealing with adversarial conditions like that are isolated, what tools do you have at your disposal to force unwind positions faster than others to better deal with contagion before things really go crazy? And to the extent that you have a more limiting collateral factor, it means that you could potentially catch things a little bit sooner, depending on how leveraged people are. So that is a positive there. But at the end of the day, because a lot of us here are looking at things in terms of fundamental backing, even in the event of everyone unwinding at the same time, theoretically speaking, like, the value should still be there, even if we're dealing with illiquidity or bad things like that happening. It really depends on who gets caught in the crossfire of accidentally or maybe purposefully using an LRT as collateral. Instead of borrowing ETH against it, they're borrowing a stable coin, and we're fundamentally valuing that. So, in a very simple example, let's say that ETH is at 4,000, which we all wish and hope that we're there right now, but let's just use that as an example. Our LRT is priced 1-to-1, 4,000, but it's temporarily depegged maybe 5-10%. On the market, it's being priced at 3,600. But we're still fundamentally saying it's 4,000. In the event of ETH going down from a contagion event or something like that, we're mispricing it when we have to liquidate that user that's going back into dollars. And that in of itself is an interesting issue, because we have tons of farmers in the room that are doing correlated loops, But no one thinks about the user that's not doing correlated hoops, but using an LRT for it, and it's being inherently mispriced. So that level of granularity is something that we think about a lot at Dolomite, and how we can use our modularity to try to solve for situations like this. And it's all about representation of risk and how we can use that to either better compensate lenders or restrict borrowing to the extent that we can keep lenders safe. So pick your poison.
Now, is this one of the cases where you would see a protocol have a different oracle for correlated and then a different oracle for uncorrelated assets?
To my knowledge, like more of the centrally pooled protocols like a Dolomite don't have a way to necessarily change the oracle unless you like relist the asset as like a USDE version 2 or version B, whatever you want to call it, that could then price it differently, put it into a different risk category, and so you can only borrow this asset against it. So that is an option. But I haven't necessarily seen too many protocols do that. I think Morpho set up to do that pretty well, though.
Aave has a thing called CAPO, that correlated asset price oracle, which is only for LSTs and LRTs back to the E-mode ETH. And we saw that, and we're going to build that. So, like, it's that simple. It's like I need higher collateral factors to be able to compete. They're like, Gauntlet's like, get us a kill switch in case of like a major contagion, and capo, and that's what we're building.
So my understanding is that a lot of the risk analysis has to do with the liquidity for the assets that might get liquidated, because liquidation typically goes through liquidity. This is one thing that a lot of people who use these platforms don't actually think about. They think, okay, I'm using a correlated asset, that's probably not a big issue, or even an uncorrelated asset. Liquidators do magic on the back end, and then I get spit out my position afterwards. But really, liquidity considerations are huge. Can you guys talk about what a money market looks at when they're looking at liquidity and how that affects leverage?
So we're building our lending market on Flow, which is historically an NFT blockchain, and they're relaunching DeFi. There's very few assets that are available on Flow right now, and so in some ways, liquidity isn't so much of an issue because it's sort of backed by a bunch of institutional actors that are backing these markets. So I don't have direct experience with some of the stuff that you guys might have had experience with. But what I do think is interesting, and again, this kind of comes back to Morpho, is that a lot of these markets are set up in a collusive way. Like, everyone who's using them has some intention of extracting value from them. And so they're set up purposefully to maintain volumes that are sustainable for market creators, lenders, and potentially, if there's a lot of liquidations, the market creator has like theoretically taken that into account, but doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
Yeah, so at this moment, it's isolated by chain. So liquidity profile per chain kind of determines the supply caps of different collaterals and of what we can get out. Like just back of the envelope calculation is something like less than 10% slippage, right? So if we can get sell ETH into USDC, less than 10% slippage, that's probably the line, right? I think what's really interesting is, and what we're trying to figure out right now is like the RWA market, right? So we have like these different firms, and I won't mention any names, there's like 2 or 3 of them that we're having this conversation with, which is, can we internalize liquidations through like a KYC offshore entity, because they will redeem $700 million on an RWA, right? So like instantly, but you can't, it's not permissionless, it's like through this KYC, and what happens if they cut us off? So From the normal DeFi permissionless, it's about how much liquidity can we get out instantly in a block or two, and then what we're trying to do is get into like RWAs and what is the determining factor or agreements in the back end to be able to list particular RWAs and get more into real world assets.
Yeah, I think that these are all really good points so far. Something more unique to Dolomite on our Arbitrum instances, we underwrite for GMX's GM tokens, for example, which underwrites for perpetuals trading on GMX. And GMX has their own restrictions that come along with it, and we built this really cool feature out called Pause Sentinel. It's basically able to read on-chain data from GMX or from whatever the integration is in real time with atomicity to be able to see what's going on with it. Can we redeem this asset? And if not, why is that? So in the case of the GM tokens, imagine a scenario in which everyone's net long on ETH. ETH is going to the moon. We're all really happy by it. And but that also means that the amount of reserves that they need to pay out to those winners is really high. So if we are underwriting for GM tokens, that means that there might be a restriction in place where we can't actually redeem them. So we actually have this pause sentinel feature that's able to cut off the addition of leverage for GM tokens, or for specific markets rather, if we see that there's ever a scenario in which like that reserve factor that they call it is basically fully capped out. So we're able to take a little bit of a more granular approach with how we underwrite for risk for them, which allows us to then pump the LTVs for them because we're able to read things in real time and then cut things off ad hoc here or there, and when that activates.
You guys also do like atomic redemptions with GMX as well?
We give the illusion of atomicity, but we have some interesting things going on there. We built out what I call an asynchronous liquidation engine for it. That basically takes the minimum amount out that we expect to get from it. And the protocol doesn't actually like front money or anything like that, but we give the illusion to the protocol that the funds are still there when in fact they've been moved out. So we basically combine together what's called our virtual liquidity system with dynamic collateral. The idea that our protocol still sees the equity you have in it, but the tokens have moved back into GMX, and they can either be sent back to us in the form of redeemed assets, or they get sent back to us because the transaction reverts and their sequencer sends it back to us. And we have mechanisms in place that will check for stuck transactions after a certain number of blocks and things of that nature. So we did a really deep integration for this, and it was not for the faint of heart, and we really questioned it because we missed the initial LRT wave. Because we started that integration, it was a lot more involved than we thought it was going to be. And before we know it, it's like late January, and everyone's already going crazy with LRTs and saying, why isn't Dolomite listing these? And we're like, they're doing these things called GM tokens, and we launched them, and no one really cared about it at first. And then LRTs went by the wayside a little bit because the yields went down, and thankfully that integration ended up doing very well for us then. But it was a very slow cook.
That's awesome. Well done.
Thank you. I built that, and it was a pain in the ass.
I kind of want to circle back to the cool things you guys are doing because you're each doing something hyper unique. You're not just lending platforms. I want to give you a chance to talk about Bobby, which is really neat. I wanted you guys to talk about POL because I don't think that anyone really understands POL yet. It's kind of.
I barely do.
Yeah, exactly. And then NFT lending markets have been one of the most interesting things out there. I want to give you a chance to sort of like explain that to someone who's probably used to what we're doing is like LRT looping to the max. So.
No, NFT.
NFT, okay. Then tell me your niche and why it's so cool then, please.
You want to start? Yeah. Okay. So basically, there's been a profusion of structured products that I think we're all aware of now. And there probably will be more that come along over the next couple of years. And there's also just a bunch of new tokens. So what our theory is behind all of this is that anyone should be able to create a structured product in just a couple of seconds if the markets exist for them and if the liquidity exists on a DEX. And so using our vaults structure, you can basically do this. It's like you can take a leverage position on any market that you choose, whether it's using a LP token or an LRT or an LST. It really doesn't matter. You choose how you set up the position. The difficult thing is unwinding those positions and then moving that liquidity into another position really quickly. And so we've built mechanisms to be able to exit people from leverage positions and migrate that liquidity into a completely different position on a completely different protocol. And the idea is to basically save time if you're doing this manually, or also time if you're building this in some automated way.
That's literally why we haven't launched Vault tokens yet. Like what you guys built, it was like, who's going to manage the liquidations, the unwinds, and that whole entire workflow. That's really cool. We're working on a different type of product called Bobby. It's basically like a bonding mechanism mixed with AI, mixed with like a stablecoin yield chaser. So what we found in the clients or whatever the large whales and liquidity providers is that they start yelling and screaming at us over DMs if the rates become too out of whack because their loops become unprofitable and their hedges become unprofitable. So like stabilization of yields is probably the biggest thing. Getting to fixed rate yields is like the holy grail of getting into TradFi. Before that, getting at least like stabilized. So we needed to build a way to stabilize stablecoin yield and we're starting with Arbitrum. So USDT, USDC native, and then USDCE, the bridge version of USDC, have yields completely fluctuating all the time. So the vault mechanism is basically a yield chaser that just takes your stablecoin and rebalances to the highest yield. The next part of that is like, that's cool. So how do we launch a mechanism to give people there longer? So then what happens when you put your stablecoin into the yield chaser, it effectively prints a token called Bobby, Bobby also has an AI component that talks in the voice of Robert Leshner, the founder of Compound, so you can communicate with it on Twitter or Telegram. And then we also, to be able to create those stable rates, there's a bonding mechanism. So there's going to be a floating price point of the receipt token, and you get a discounted rate depending on how long you'll bond. So, 1 day, 7 days, 30 days, I think 6 months is like the tops. We're figuring all that out, and we're launching it very soon. And it's kind of like a mechanism design in which you want to lock up stables for longer so that we can kind of be a little bit more predictive about the stable rates. And then it has like a nice little AI narrative slipstream with it too.
Very cool. Love the name, by the way. With Dolomite, we have two really big things cooking. The first on Berachain is our integration with proof of liquidity. Just to do a little bit of a history lesson, we rolled out an Arbitrum, which caught the eyes of the Berachain team, was our dynamic collateral system that I was mentioning beforehand. So for those of you guys that have tried our Stake GMX or SGMX product on Dolomite, what it lets you do is take the GMX tokens that are put into Dolomite, that are put into a personal credit account. It's not socialized, it's not in a pool. It will move the assets, the underlying GMX, into the GMX contracts and stake them for you. And then you get a personalized interest rate. So back in the world of multiplier points and having personalized yield, you weren't worrying about someone else withdrawing the GMX tokens and then screwing over your interest rate. Personally, it was all personalized for you then. And this really set us down the path of being able to, what I call, retain your DeFi functionality with your assets while you borrow against them on Dolomite. And this concept meshes really nicely with Berachain because proof of liquidity, simply put, it's like a staking contract on chain. So we're able to rehypothecate your underlying collateral, move it into proof of liquidity so you can earn those rewards while you borrow against the assets again on Dolomite. But we take this one step further because you earn BGT, or if you put the assets into Infrared, you can earn IBGT then. And you can then take the IBGT asset, stake that, earn the yield from that, claim the rewards which get put into your Dolomite balance, and then also borrow against the staked IBGT all at the same time. So you have full access to the proof of liquidity lifecycle at your fingertips. And this allows for some really crazy strategies with good capital efficiency, not just only for looping up assets, but also for hedging them, being able to tame the yield, get some delta neutral farming going. But then beyond that, we're looking to roll out other things as well, not just for Berachain, but for Arbitrum as well. And using our modularity, we're actually working on a smart debt and smart collateral feature similar to Fluid, but with our own Dolomite twist to it. Essentially more of an RFQ-like mechanism using Chainlink that will price fees based upon volatility and be able to use that in order to lower borrow fees effectively and also increase the yield that you can earn on your collateral then. So it's something really exciting that we're looking to roll out there with it and hopefully do it on many chains. But for the smart debt feature, we actually want to roll it out on Arbitrum initially because the infrastructure there is very tried and tested. Block times are very fast and snappy, and we have a lot more excitement over the stablecoin ecosystem there. Whereas Berachain's more of it in its infancy there, and block time is a little bit slower, and the liquidity profile on the network's still fleshing out, despite how large it is. There's still a lot of things that need to get moved over from an infrastructure perspective when it comes to liquidations and more providers being on chain.
Going back to the original question in like the proof of liquidity, I want to talk on that point for a quick second. Is DeFi over leveraged? And we're out of time. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. If DeFi is over leveraged because there's too much security on Ethereum, right? So if economic security is just a meme and it doesn't become like a real yield component, then it is over leveraged. And so I really like the proof of liquidity because it's moving the meme of economic security to like the economic efficiency of each individual dApp. So instead of like incentivizing the security, it's really at the dApp level and like all these experiments and that may get over leveraged. If you guys figure out as a dApp how to game that, then proof of liquidity could get over leveraged.
Thank you guys so much for joining us and watching, and thank you all to our panelists. Go leverage up some go check out the protocols, and thank you again to the guests.
Bet more.